So the first thing you're going to want to do before you make your enriched bread is to line your baking tins. To do so, you're going to need scissors. You're also going to need some butter to just gently butter the inside of your tin. Make sure to get right into the corners, because what you're going to do is then lay some parchment paper on top, and your butter will help the parchment paper to stick in the mold, and that will also help to define the shape of your loaf. So what you're going to do to line with the parchment paper, you're going to take a piece of parchment paper that is slightly wider than your cake tin, cut 2 to 3 inches in on either side, flip it around, do the same on the other side, and then press it into your buttered tin. You'll then be able to see that it sticks to the loaf tin, which will give you a nice even form. If there's a lot of paper overhanging, you can then cut off any excess paper, and that's how we line our tin. And just to do it again, parchment paper slightly larger than our tin, cutting in 2 to 3 inches either side, flip the paper around, again kind of 2 to 3 inches. And what this is going to enable you to do is press your paper in, and it will kind of fold around the edges of your tin so that it sticks nice and evenly all the way around, and you don't get something that's more kind of curved at the bottom of your cake tin. So when we have our flour in our bowl, we're going to add our salt and our sugar on one side of the bowl. And then we're going to go ahead and put our yeast into the other side of the bowl. The reason is salt and sugar and yeast interact in a way that will inhibit or kill the action of your yeast. Salt and yeast in direct contact with each other, the salt will immediately kill your yeast. And your sugar is kind of like how we react, or humans react with alcohol, in that a little bit of sugar is great, a little for the yeast, because yeast eats sugar in order to reproduce CO2 and alcohol, but too much sugar is going to kill your yeast completely. We then drain in our liquid slowly, adding our milk and our egg. And then we wait until our dough becomes something of a rough ball, and more or less all of your flour is incorporated before we start adding our butter. The reason is, well, twofold. Firstly, it's really good practice to get into, because the more butter you add, the later in the process you need to add that butter. So doing it kind of late on in this process is a good introduction to that. The second reason is butter, or any fat generally, inhibits the formation of gluten. So if we add our butter later in the process, our gluten is already beginning to form in our hydrated flour, so there is less chance of overmixing, there is less chance of under formation of the gluten in our dough. Really important that our butter is soft, because it's much easier to incorporate, and will emulsify into our dough much more easily. Once the butter has been incorporated, we can then go ahead and turn up the speed in our mixer, and start to develop the gluten in our dough. So we're looking at a medium speed in our mixer. In a KitchenAid, that's kind of somewhere 4 to 6 as a speed, until our gluten is developed. The longer we mix our dough, the more elastic our dough is going to become. And what we're going to look for here is that our dough at the end of our mixing process passes what's known as the window pane test. The window pane test basically means that you stretch your dough thin enough that you can see your fingers through the dough, but your dough isn't ripping. Kind of like if you've ever seen somebody making those super thin pizzas on TV that they throw up in the air and then catch on their fingertips that look really, really thin. That's basically the premise here. We have super developed gluten, so we're getting something that's super, super stretchy and elastic and can get stretched out really, really thin. So to check for window pane, what we're going to do is take a relatively small amount of our dough. I'm not going to say that it's a tiny amount, because for a tiny amount of dough, the action of forming the window pane test might be enough to develop your gluten enough to give you window pane. And pulling from the middle of our dough outwards, we're going to look to stretch our dough as thin as possible. Once we can stretch it enough that we can see our fingers through the dough, like you can do in the dough here, our dough is ready to be proved. Your first fermentation is going to take anything between kind of 50 minutes to an hour. It's going to depend on the conditions that you're proofing your bread at. If it's a nice warm area, the proofing is going to be quicker. If it's a cooler area, the proofing is going to be considerably slower. So once we've passed our window pane test, we're going to take our dough out onto our table, and then we're going to form it into a nice smooth ball before we put our dough to ferment. The reason we're forming our smooth ball is that smoothness, or that smooth surface on top, is going to help to give you an even rise on your dough. We're then going to grease our proofing tin before placing our dough into the proofing bucket, tin, whatever you want to call it. And then a little trick that I like to use, we're going to take a small amount of masking tape or painter's tape, or even sellotape will work absolutely fine. And we're going to mark the point at which our dough meets the edge of our proofing bucket. The reason is, what we're looking for our dough to prove is that it doubles in size. There are so many factors that can contribute to your dough proofing or not proofing. So the use of sellotape basically, or the use of the tape, makes it easy to figure out when our dough is proved properly. And you can see, once our dough is proved, it's going to have doubled more or less on top of where our tape is. So we know our dough is ready to take out of the bucket. So the next step on the road is to punch down or degas your dough. During the fermentation process, gases have formed, so we now need to take out those gases to release the tension that is in our gluten network to make our dough easier to shape and more liable to hold its final shape. What we're then going to do is, for this dough specifically, for our 2 loaves, we're going to divide our dough in 2. And then we're going to gently round those balls, or those pieces, into balls, so that again we're going to form a nice smooth surface on top. And we're going to leave our dough rest for kind of 5 to 10 minutes so that our gluten can relax, which makes it easier for shaping again. So for our final shaping, we're going to take our nice relaxed dough balls and we're going to form them into the shape of a loaf. The reason we want them nice and relaxed is to make this step much, much easier, and we don't get any dough kind of contracting or working against us. What we're going to do, flip our dough over, Divide it into thirds in your head, and using the heel of your hand, fold your dough over 1/3 over the middle third and then over the bottom third again. Then take your loaf tin, make sure that your dough is more or less the same length, and then if we need to, repeat the process. So divide your dough into thirds in your head, 1/3 over the middle third, roll it over in itself, make sure it's more or less the same length as your tin, fold it back over, seal the seam at the bottom, super important, and then fold in the edges to give you a nice square edge, and your dough goes into your tin. The reason we're making sure that the seam is closed on the bottom is to make sure that our dough doesn't kind of open in the wrong way while it's proofing, or it doesn't open up and kind of open out the side of your tin, which could result in your bread dough coming out of the mold in the wrong way. So again, sealing the bottom of your loaf, fold in the edges to give you a nice square edge, and then into your tin. So once your loaves are ready to go and they're in the tin, they're ready for the second proof. Your second proof is going to be slightly shorter than your first proof, probably in the region of kind of 5 to 10 minutes or so. Again, you're looking for bread that is doubled in volume. So once your dough is proved, it's going to have more or less filled your cake or your loaf tin. To check if it's proved properly, place your finger gently into the dough. If your finger doesn't put, or if the indent doesn't push back out, your dough is ready to be put in the oven. So the final step is to egg wash our dough before baking. This egg wash is just an equal amount of milk and egg, which gives you a nice golden color at the end. The bread then goes in the oven for 350 degrees until it reads 190 to 210 and is nice and golden brown on the outside. You're going to be, depending on the oven, depending on whether there's a fan or not, something along the lines of kind of 30 minutes or so at least. And once your thermometer inserted into the middle comes out somewhere between 190 and 210, which you can see in this one, 203 or 202.6 I should say, your dough is ready to go. And remember to let your bread come to room temperature before cutting, eating and enjoying. Thanks for watching the video, folks. If you like what you saw, please give me a like and a subscribe, share the video with your friends, and remember to check back often because I'll be posting videos regularly on my site. In the meantime, happy baking!